The seat, please. We shall start. May you have a seat, please? Thank you. بالعربي. حبوا تتفضلوا أهلا وسهلا. Okay. Communication, okay. Communication, okay. Okay. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, here present or following us on the media, good evening. My name is Antoine Al-Ahmar, and I am very pleased to greet you on behalf of the Middle East Council of Churches, St. Joseph University, and the Bible Society, who organized this conference on religious freedom given by the Right Reverend Philip Mونستيفين, Bishop of Truro in the United Kingdom. Before listening to His Excellency, Father Professor Salim Dakkash, the President of the University, is going to say a word of welcome. Then Dr. Michel Abs, MECC General Secretary, will talk briefly about the topic, while Dr. Mike Bassous, General Secretary and CEO of the Bible Society, will introduce the speaker. A session of questions and answers will follow the conference. And before giving the floor to Father President, I would like to remind you that a simultaneous translation is available in two languages, Arabic and English. الترجمة الفورية مؤمنة باللغتين العربية والإنجليزية. Directeur, la parole est à vous. Merci.
Good evening, مساء الخير. صاحب السيادة المطران فيليب مونستيفين، صاحب السماحة الإخوة والأخوات، الآباء والمحبين، كلمتي في هذه المناسبة تختصر بالقليل من المعاني. الترحيب أولا بكم جميعا باسمي وباسم كلية العلوم الدينية وعميدها. أتيتم للاستماع إلى سيادة المطران فيليب مونستيفين في موضوع الحريات الدينية، وهي ليست موضوعا عابرا، بل إنها قضية يجدر البحث فيها في منابر الجامعة وفي الفضاء الأكاديمي، فلا تبقى حكرا على بعض الشعبويين والانتهازيين. ثانيا، كلمة شكر لجمعية الكتاب المقدس بشخص أمينها العام الدكتور مايكل بسوس لانفتاحه على مختلف المسائل المتعلقة لا بالكتاب المقدس حصرا، بل بالقضايا الهامة التي تهم بلادنا وتهم الحوار الإسلامي المسيحي، والأدوات والمنهجيات التي تسهل الطريق ليكون هذا الحوار في العمق وليس في الشكليات والسطحيات الباهتة. فنحن نثمن هذه الشراكة بين الجامعة اليسوعية في بيروت والجمعية التي أصبحت الملتقى لمختلف الكنائس والتقاليد. وثالثا، كلمة تقدير أوجهها لمجلس كنائس الشرق الأوسط بشخص أمينه العام الدكتور ميشيل عبس، وهو من عندنا، لما يبذله من جهد متواصل لتبقى خدمة الشراكة المسكونية قائمة ومتقدة، وبالتالي لكي تبقى شهادة المسيحيين في هذا الشرق انعكاسا لنور المسيح المخلص، خصوصا في هذه الأيام الظالمة والمظلمة. لن أقدم ضيف الشرف المتحدث اليوم، فله من يتكلم عنه أكتفي بالقول إنه من دواعي حضوره بيننا هو الحديث عن قضية الحرية الدينية في هذه المنطقة وفي العالم، وانحسارها وانكسارها أحيانا، وتصل إلى حد الاضطهاد، وفي الكلمة دلالة على أن يسعى الواحد إلى كم فم الآخر والتضييق عليه وعلى تحركه والضغط عليه وقضم حقوقه حتى الرمق الأخير. ولقد أعطيت سيادة المطران فيليب مونستيفين بالأمس لبنان في السفارة البريطانية نموذجا لعيش الحركة الدينية غير عبر التعددية، وقلت أنه من دواعي وجودك بيننا هو محبتك لهذا البلد الرسالة، ونحن نسعى ونجهد إلى تثبيت هذه التعددية عبر العيش معا وتحقيق الخلاص عبر بناء المواطنية الحق التي وحدها تؤكد الحريات والحقوق والواجبات بين الناس في مختلف الميادين. أجدد شكري لكم وللمحاضر الكريم، فأقول إن هذه الجامعة منذ أنشئت في السنة 1875 أرادت أن تكون حاضرة للفكر المنير والمستنير وواحة أمل ورجاء بالرغم من حروب مضت وأيام صعبة عشناها ونعيشها، إلا أننا نبقى في حالة إيمان بالقيامة وحالة أمل ورجاء نعمل من أجلها لتبقى لنا الحياة وفيرة. والشكر لإصغائكم.
شكرا الأب الرئيس البروفيسور سليم دكاش. بالحقيقة طبعا بحس حالي بعدني هون ات هوم من سنة 1973 لحد هلا. أنا بعدني بهالجامعة، وكل ما اكتسبته من معرفة ودراية هو من هذه الجامعة ومن الحياة طبعا، ومن صفوفها ومحاضراتها ونشاطاتها. سيادة المطران فيليب مونستيفين الجزيل الاحترام، مطران ترورو، حضرة الأب الرئيس سليم دكاش، سماحة الشيخ، الأصدقاء حضرات القسس والآباء الأجلاء، أهلا وسهلا بكم. سوف أتكلم عامة عن حرية المعتقد وكرامة الإنسان وإنسانيته، انطلاقا من مسلمة أن لا شيء يعادل الحرية بالنسبة إلى الإنسان. أكلمكم عن حرية المعتقد. يزخر التاريخ البشري بكل أشكال التمييز والاضطهاد الدينيين، منذ الخلاف على عبادة الأوثان إلى الحروب الدينية الحديثة التي استخدمت فيها أحدث تقنيات الفتك والتواصل والتضليل. أن يكون هناك اضطهاد ديني في غابر الأزمنة عندما كانت البشرية تتلمس طريقها نحو اكتشاف الخالق كما نحو التحضر، فهذا أمر طبيعي. ولكن أن نشهد اليوم في القرن 21 تمييزا دينيا وطائفيا مضافا إلى أشكال تمييز أخرى منها العرقي والعنصري، فهذا يؤشر إلى أن البشرية ما زالت مأزومة أو أنها تعود القهقرة. المجتمع الحديث اليوم هو تركيبة شديدة التنوع بحكم الهجرات الدولية التي تذهب في كل الاتجاهات لتجعل المجتمعات الحديثة موزاييك إثني وعرقي وحكما ديني لا مثيل له في التاريخ البشري الجلي. من هنا نرى غزارة الإنتاج الفكري حول إدارة التنوع والمواطنة الحاضنة لهذا التنوع، لأن المعنيين بالمصير الإنساني قلقون حول مآل الأمور في هذه المجتمعات التي تعد بمئات الملايين والتي تحتضن عشرات المجموعات البشرية والدينية المختلفة بالأصول واللون والعرق والدين وغيره. لقد تأسست خلال العقود العشرة المنصرمة مئات الهيئات الحكومية وغير الحكومية الدولية منها والمحلية، وأنتجت عشرات الشرع والوثائق التاريخية التي تحث على احترام معتقد الآخر وقبوله، كما أنتج الفكر الإنساني عددا لا حصر له من المؤلفات والدراسات والمقالات حول هذا الموضوع، ولكن على ضوء التقارير التي تصلنا حول التمييز والاضطهاد الدينيين في العالم يتبين لنا أن كل هذه الجهود لم تؤتي النتائج المرجوة. إننا نشهد تصاعد خطابات التعصب والتزمت والكراهية والتمييز بشكل مضطرد، وتساعد على ذلك شبكة الإنترنت المترامية الأطراف والتي لا مجال لضبطها. ومهما حاولت إدارات مؤسسات التواصل ضبط الأمر فإنها تبقى متأخرة بالنسبة إلى تفشي هذه الخطابات بين الناس واستقطابها وبلورة أفكار المجمعات العصبية نحو رفض الآخر ورذله. هذه الشبكة نفسها تنبينا يوميا أيضا بما لا يسر ولا يطمئن. نقرأ يوميا عن أحداث لها طابع الاضطهاد الديني، وينتج عنها أحيانا قتل وجرح ودمار وتشرد، وذلك في الكثير من مناطق العالم. والجدير ذكره أن هذه الأحداث لا تحمل الطابع الديني فحسب، بل الطابع الإثني والعرقي أو الشوفيني أيضا، وهذا أمر لا يبشر بالخير. البشرية إذن في سباق محموم بين الخير والشر، بين المحبة والبغضاء، إذ نجد أنه مقابل تصاعد نشاط المؤسسات التي تعمل لتطوير التفاعل والحوار بين الناس، هناك تصاعد لنشاط من يعمل على هدم هذه الإنجازات الثقافية القيمية التي بنتها البشرية خلال قرون من الزمن، والتي جرى التحضير لها لقرون سبقت من خلال كتابات المتنورين. أن يضطهد إنسان بسبب أمر ما، أكان دينه أم عقيدته السياسية أم جنسيته أم انتمائه الإثني، في زمن الإعجازات العلمية ووسائل التواصل المتقدمة، ففي ذلك ما يستدعي العمل الحثيث على معالجة الأمر وبشتى الوسائل المتاحة. إن المسؤولية تقع على عاتق الدول التي إما أنها سنت تشريعات تحض على التمييز والكراهية، أو أنها لم تجترح السياسات الناجعة لمحاربة هذه الظواهر بما فيه الكفاية. إن محاربة التمييز بشكل عام هو جزء من بناء المواطن ذو المواطنة الكاملة والحاضنة للتنوع، يحتاج إلى منظومة متكاملة تشمل التشريع والإعلام والتربية، ثلاثة الأساسيات. دون ذلك حرب أهلية تحصل كل نصف قرن تقريبا، فلا تبقي ولا تذر. تجربتنا في لبنان عامة كلبنانيين، وتجربتي من خلال العمل التنموي المسكوني كما من خلال اللجنة الوطنية الإسلامية المسيحية للحوار، أظهرت أنه من الممكن الحلول دون توسل الدين في السياسة في الكثير من الحالات، ولكنها تبقى محدودة دون برنامج حكومي هادف وطويل الأمد في التشريع والتربية والإعلام. ما يساعد في ذلك هو التنوع الذي يتميز به لبنان ومناخ الحريات العامة رغم بعض الشوائب التي تعتريه. لقد قدم إلينا في اللجنة الإسلامية المسيحية للحوار كثير من الوفود الأوروبية يستشيروننا عن أساليب وآليات الحوار التي نعتمدها على اعتبار أن التجربة اللبنانية بحد ذاتها رائدة. فكان محور جوابنا أن البنى الاجتماعية الدينية في لبنان الإثنية أيضا هي قاعدة عملنا وحياة التفاعل التي يعيشها اللبنانيون منذ عقود، هي الضامن لنجاح عملنا. لقد أطلقت على لبنان عدة تسميات، ولكن أفضلها كان المايكروكوسم، الكون المصغر، فهي تختصر كل ما نريد أن نصف به لبنان. إنه بالنسبة إلى التنوع في العالم المختبر أو النموذج البايلوت، وما ينجح في لبنان يمكن تطبيقه في أمكنة عديدة من العالم. أما تجربة بيت العيلة المصرية فهي تجربة رائدة أيضا، دعمتها الحكومة المصرية بسياسة طويلة الأمد تهدف إلى بناء المواطنة الكاملة الحاضنة للتنوع بشكل منهجي سيستماتيك. بيت العيلة المصري مؤسسة تضم الكنيسة القبطية والأزهر على مستوى القيادات، يعملون على تفادي النزاعات الدينية أو منع تفاقمها حين تحصل. لقد نجحت هذه المعادلة في لجم النزاعات الدينية التي استشرت في مصر في الحقبة الماضية، وقد شهدنا انحسارا ملحوظا للاعتداءات ذات الطابع الديني رغم حادثة الإسكندرية وحادثة غيرها. نحن اليوم في مجلس كنائس الشرق الأوسط نستعد لتأسيس دائرة الحوار والتماسك الاجتماعي التي تهدف إلى إطلاق مشاريع تتوخى إعادة بناء الرأسمالي الاجتماعي المدمر في مجتمعاتنا بحكم النزاعات والإفقار والتهجير طبعا. وسوف تكون باكورة مشاريع هذه الدائرة في لبنان والعراق ومصر. نحن كمؤسسة مسكونية ننطلق من أن نعرف الحق والحق يحررنا، لذلك نتطلع إلى مجتمعات سوية يحيا فيها المواطن حياة كريمة لا يشعر فيها أي منهم لا بالاضطهاد ولا بالتهديد، لا المعلنين ولا الصامتين. نحن نتوق إلى أن يكون مال قيصر لقيصر ومال الله لله، فيدخل الناس في علاقات موضوعية معاييرها لا تتقبل لا التمييز ولا العنصرية، بل الروابط الاجتماعية الطبيعية، حيث تصبح العلاقات بين أتباع مختلف الديانات لا تعايش ولا تسامح، بل تقبل واحترام للفروقات بين كل أشكال الانتماء. في بلداننا الطريق طويل ووعر، لأن قوى الشر تتسلح بشتى الذرائع من أجل أن تمنع أبناء النور من السير في مجتمعهم نحو شاطئ الأمان والتقدم. التحدي كبير، ولكن الإرادات صلبة، ولا بد من متابعة المسير نحو الحرية، الضمان الأول للكرامة. من ضمن هذا السياق نستمع اليوم إلى سيادة المطران فيليب مونستيفين، مطران ترورو في المملكة المتحدة، والذي يعمل على مشكلة الحريات الدينية، لكي نقف على ما سوف يقوله لنا نحن أبناء المجتمع الرسالة. فأهلا وسهلا به. شكرا.
مساء الخير. راح أحكي باللغة الإنجليزية. Father, Professor Salim Dakash, President of St. Joseph University, former Vice Chairman of the Bible Society, Dr. Michel Abs, our partner and our associate in the interconfessional and ecumenical world, Bishop Philip. When we met 5 months ago in Cambridge for the Magi Initiative, and you said you wanted to come to Lebanon, I thought this will happen in the next 3 to 5 years. Here we are 5 months later, welcoming you to this wonderful university to listen to parts of your report and your findings. I'm going to introduce Bishop Philip Monstíven and then hand over to him. Prior to becoming the 16th Bishop of Truro, Bishop Philip was the executive leader of the Church Mission Society, CMS, enabling networking across the Anglican Communion and beyond. Bishop Philip was ordained as a deacon in 1988 and priested in 1989. He served his curacy at Gerrard's Cross and Fulham in the Diocese of Oxford, and then served as the vicar of St. James Church, West Strandham, in the Diocese of Southwark from 1992 till 1998. In 1998, Philip joined the Church Pastoral Aid Society, initially tasked with helping churches develop youth and children ministry, then served as head of ministry and ultimately as the Deputy General Director from 2004 to 2007. In 2007, Bishop Philip moved with his wife Ruth and daughter Kitty to Paris. He speaks French. He will greet us today. Oh, that was supposed to be a surprise, sorry. Where he was the chaplain of St. Michael's Church in the center of Paris, a multicultural church with a congregation who spoke around 40 different languages. In late 2012, Bishop Philip left Paris for his role at the Church Mission Society. Philip oversaw the operation of all CMS's mission in 40 countries, leading a community of around 3,000 members and supporting around 350 people in mission around the world. Bishop Philip was consecrated on November 2018 by the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Most Reverend Justin Welby, at St. Paul Cathedral, London, and was welcomed to the Diocese of Truro on January 12, 2019. Back a month in December 2018, 1 month after becoming a bishop, he was asked by the then Foreign Secretary, Wazir al-Kharji, to investigate how well or otherwise the Foreign Office in the UK had responded to the global issue of the global persecution of Christians. The recommendations of the final report, published 7 months later after being assigned, were subsequently accepted in full by the UK government. He retains a significant interest in this area and also chairs the Church of England's Partnership for World Mission, the umbrella body which gathers together the C&E's various specialist mission agencies. Please join me in welcoming Bishop Philip.
Merci Mike. Mesdames, Messieurs, Monsieur le Recteur, je veux juste commencer, comme Mike a déjà dit, avec quelques mots en français, par respect de la tradition de cette belle université. Monsieur le Recteur, vous êtes là. Je vous remercie tellement pour votre accueil si chaleureux. C'est un vrai honneur pour moi d'être là avec mon équipe, d'être là avec vous ce soir. It is an honor to be with you. And it's a great pleasure to be with you too, for many reasons. There are 2 general reasons why I'm pleased to be here, and other reasons more specific to the topic of freedom of religion or belief, which is so important to so many of us here today. There are 2 general reasons why I'm delighted to be here. First of all, this is not my first time in Lebanon. I was first here 4.5 years ago, and I was deeply impressed. I was deeply impressed by what I found, specifically by the way in which churches and other community groups had responded to the refugee crisis. I was touched and moved by the generosity of spirit and the genuine hospitality I saw being exercised. In the UK, we get very anxious when a few thousand people cross the channel in inflatable boats. You have welcomed millions of people to this country. I know that that has not been easy. I know that that has been a great challenge. I know they have not been universally welcomed, but I have seen them welcomed, and I have been very touched and moved by that. And that experience led me to have a real desire to develop a link with Lebanon when I became Bishop of Truro. And there is another reason, too, why we should do that. For there is a deep and an ancient partnership between Cornwall and Lebanon. It was the Phoenicians who came to Cornwall to trade tin with the Cornish people. And this is a very ancient partnership. Tin ingots, blocks of metal, were brought up from an ancient shipwreck in the eastern Mediterranean a couple of years ago, and they were demonstrably from Cornwall. And the ship itself was dated to between 1400 and 1600 BC. In fact, there would have been no Bronze Age were it not for Cornish tin and Phoenician traders working in partnership. So the rest of the world owes us a debt of gratitude, and we're waiting to hear them say thank you. This has been a world-changing partnership between Cornwall and Lebanon. So those are my general reasons for being delighted to be here. But more specifically, and for reasons I will explain shortly, the whole issue of freedom of religion or belief has become very important to me in recent years. And again, Lebanon is very significant in that regard too. Yours is the only country in this region with a studied commitment to religious pluralism and diversity. Now, I know that has often been, and still is, a real challenge, but I do urge you not to give up on facing that challenge. It is vital, not just for this country, but for this region and for the wider world too. As the Lebanese ambassador to the UK pointed out to me when we were beginning the work of the review, over, I have to say, a very fine lunch in the Lebanese embassy, he pointed out to me that countries with a deep commitment to pluralism pose less of a security threat and are more reliable partners in trade and in other ways too. And I'm sure that's right. So there are good practical reasons, alongside really important moral reasons, for valuing freedom of religion or belief. So Lebanon is a significant place from a Forb, and I will say Forb rather than freedom of religion or belief because it saves time. Lebanon is a significant place from a Forb perspective. I know you have a vibrant Forb round table set up with members of that round table here today. The Beirut Declaration is a landmark statement on Forb from a Muslim perspective, and I am delighted that you will be hosting the meeting of the International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance next year, and that is no accident. It is no accident that Lebanon should be chosen to host that meeting. This issue is increasingly on the global agenda, and rightly so. It is a serious global issue. Just recently, tensions between Hindu and Muslim communities in South Asia have manifested themselves on the streets of cities in the UK. We are globally connected, and the denial of Forb is a serious global issue, and global issues require global solutions. So, with that introduction, explaining why I'm delighted and honoured to be here in Lebanon, let me give you some insight into the specific work that I and those who've worked alongside me have undertaken regarding Forb, a perspective which I hope will help you as you pursue this agenda in this country today. So, as Mike said, I had an unusual start to my Christmas in 2018, when 2 days before Christmas, I was rung up by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby. Unfortunately, to my disappointment, he wasn't ringing to wish me Happy Christmas. He was asking me if I'd be willing to lead a review of the way that the UK Foreign Office, the FCO as it was then, had addressed or otherwise the persecution of Christians. And it became clear that this was a request from the then Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt himself, who was very moved by the issue and clearly concerned both about the human stories of those caught up in persecution and worried too that his department might not be doing enough about it. To be honest, it was terrible timing for me. I hadn't even started my new job, but I knew what an important issue this was, and so I said yes. But why was it needed? It's now several years since the Times of London published an editorial entitled "Spectators at the Carnage," and it began like this. Across the globe, in the Middle East, Asia and Africa, Christians are being bullied, arrested, jailed, expelled and executed. Christianity is by most calculations the most persecuted religion of modern times. Yet Western politicians until now have been reluctant to speak out in support of Christians in peril. Well, happily, Jeremy Hunt, in his 1 year as Foreign Secretary, was willing to speak out and to act, and so we set the review up. Now, in some ways, it seems as if the persecution of Christians had come out of a clear blue sky. I remember when I was a student that it was a real issue in the days of the Cold War, when Christians and churches in some contexts in the Soviet bloc experienced significant pressure. But after 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall, it seemed to recede, only to creep up on us by degrees in the intervening period. Now, there are two striking factors, I believe, behind its re-emergence. First, where once it seemed only to be located behind the Iron Curtain, it has re-emerged now as a truly global phenomenon. But it is not a single global phenomenon. It has multiple triggers and multiple drivers. The second striking factor is that because the re-emergence of Christian persecution has been gradual and has lacked a single driver, it has to some extent been overlooked in the West. And the Western response, or the Western lack of response, has, I think, been tinged by a certain, what you might call, post-Christian bewilderment, if not embarrassment, about matters of faith and a consequent failure to grasp how, for the vast majority of the world's inhabitants, faith and religious belief is crucial to how they see themselves, to how they organize their lives, and to how they behave. Faith and belief are simply not a leisure pursuit, as is often thought of in Western contexts. Faith and belief rather are fundamental markers of identity, both individual and communal, for the majority of the world's inhabitants. Now, at the launch of the review in January 2019, I outlined 6 reasons why I felt that the review, focusing specifically on the plight of Christians, was needed. And I will repeat those quite briefly now. First of all, I said, we have to appreciate that today the Christian faith is primarily a phenomenon of the global south, and it is therefore primarily a phenomenon of the global poor. It is not, again, as people in the West tend to think, the Christian faith is not primarily an expression of white Western privilege. And unless we understand that it is primarily a phenomenon of the global poor, we will never give this issue the attention it, and indeed those people, deserve. Secondly, this particular focus on Christian persecution, I said, was justified because Christian persecution, like no other form of persecution, is a global phenomenon. And it is so because the Christian faith is a truly global phenomenon. Christian persecution is not limited to one context or to one challenge. It is a single global phenomenon, but it has multiple drivers, and as such, I believe it deserves special attention. Very specifically, and it is most important to say this, Christian persecution is certainly not limited to Islamic majority contexts. And the work of my review was never going to provide ammunition for the Islamophobic far right in Britain. To focus on one cause alone of Christian persecution is to be willfully blind to others. And it is vital to remember that Muslims are far more likely to be the victims of Forb violations than they are perpetrators of them. If we are committed to freedom of religion or belief for all, we must turn our backs firmly on Islamophobia. Thirdly, I said, Christian persecution is a human rights issue and should be seen as such. Freedom of religion or belief is arguably the most fundamental human right because so many others depend upon it. In the West, we often tend to set one right against another. But in much of the world, this right is not in opposition to others, but is rather the linchpin on which others depend. And we in the West need to be awake to such dependencies and not dismiss Forb as irrelevant to other rights. If freedom of religion or belief is removed, then so many other rights are lost as well. Fourthly, I said, this is not about special pleading for Christians, but rather making up a significant deficit. I do believe that in the UK we have been blind to this issue. Jeremy Hunt said that he thought we'd been blind to it because of post-colonial guilt, a sense that we have interfered uninvited in certain contexts in the past, so we should not do so again. Now that is understandable. But this is not about special pleading for Christians, I would argue. Rather, it is about ensuring that Christians in the global south have a fair deal and have a fair share of the UK's attention and concern. So it is, if you like, an equality issue. If one minority is on the receiving end of 80% of religiously motivated discrimination, it is simply not just that they should receive so little attention. Fifthly, however, I said, this is also about being sensitive to discrimination and persecution of all minorities. Because the Christian faith is perhaps the one truly global faith, it's become a bellwether for repression more generally. In other words, if Christians are being discriminated against in one context or another, you can be confident that other minorities will be too. So I argued, renewing a focus on Christian persecution is actually a way of expressing our concern for all minorities who find themselves under pressure. And ignoring Christian persecution might well mean that we're ignoring other forms of repression affecting other communities as well. And finally, I argued, to look at this from a specifically Christian perspective, the Christian faith has always been subversive. The earliest Christian creed consisted of just 3 words, and those words were, Jesus is Lord. And those words were not empty. In fact, they explain why from the earliest days the Christian faith attracted persecution. Because to say that Jesus is Lord was to say that the Roman Emperor, Caesar, was not Lord, as he claimed to be. So from its earliest days, the Christian faith has presented a radical challenge to any power that makes absolute claims for itself. And of course, there are many powers in the world today who make absolute claims for themselves. And that is precisely why the persecution of Christians today is a global phenomenon and not a local or a regional one. Nonetheless, the focus of my review's recommendations was clearly on guaranteeing freedom of religion or belief for all, and not just for some. To argue for special pleading for one group over another would, I believe, be deeply un-Christian. It would also, ironically, expose that group to greater risk by isolating them and unintentionally portraying them as agents of the West. I believe with all my heart that we must seek freedom of religion or belief for everyone, without fear or favor. So I am concerned with rights for all. Thus, I do want to acknowledge, and do so publicly tonight, the significant persecution that other communities have suffered. The Rohingya community in Myanmar have suffered grievously, as have the Yazidis in Iraq. The Ahmadis have been persecuted since their inception. It's right to recognize the suffering of Christians in India and China, but it would be very wrong to ignore the persecution of Muslim communities in those countries, including the Uyghur Muslims, who have suffered appallingly. In many places in the world, it is not safe to admit that you are an atheist. Jehovah's Witnesses have experienced severe persecution historically and are certainly not free of it today. And of course, and I say this with shame, Christians have also historically been the persecutors of others. I think with shame of the Crusades. There are standing reminders in the Crusader forts of that in this country. I think with shame of the Inquisition. I think with shame of the pogroms. But this is not simply an historical phenomenon. Some of the violence in recent years in the Central African Republic has been initiated by Christian militia, and responsibility for the dreadful massacre of 8,373 Bosniak Muslims in Srebrenica in July 1995 must be laid squarely at the feet of those who call themselves Christian. So in sum, I wanted to be able to justify the work of the review, and indeed to found the work of the review on values that were acceptable in terms of Western liberal democracy so that they might make a difference, and in ways that were drawn from the Christian faith, because of course there were issues of my own integrity in all of this as well. So how did we go about it? And when I say we, I include in that my good friends and colleagues David Fieldsend and Rachel Varney, who were key members of the team who worked on it. Well, the first thing we did to go about our work was to establish a working definition of persecution. If I quote page 15 of the report, I'm actually quoting David, who said, "In the absence of an agreed and much-needed academic definition of persecution, the review has proceeded on the understanding that persecution is discriminatory treatment, where that treatment is accompanied by actual or perceived threats of violence or other forced coercion." So having established that working definition, I put together the team. We were supported by people from key NGOs and by staff from the Foreign Office. And then we drew up a map of the global situation, which was published at Easter 2019 as the interim report. We selected a few focus countries so as to analyze the general situation there, and we undertook some in-depth studies of particular cases of persecution in those places, and then examined how the Foreign Office had responded. We also compared the Foreign Office response with what other countries and international bodies were doing globally to address the situation, as well as examining some key documents from the Foreign Office itself. And all of that was underpinned by a very significant body of research. Members of the review team undertook in-person visits to a number of countries, places such as Hong Kong, Nigeria, Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Egypt, Israel, and the UAE, and I believe Lebanon. Is that right? Yes, it was. Good. In-country members of the team met with Foreign Office officials and with members of local Christian communities to take evidence from them. We surveyed every single British embassy or High Commission around the world with a searching questionnaire, and of course we processed all the evidence to produce a fuller picture of how the Foreign Office was responding to this issue. We received a steady stream of written submissions. The team undertook 2 weeks of closed oral sessions in Westminster Abbey, where we heard from 75 people, survivors of persecution amongst them, sharing often harrowing accounts of their suffering. And in all, we heard evidence from 23 specific countries. Now, I say all that because it means that in the end, we were able to produce an evidence-based report which focused in forensic detail on a number of countries and on a number of specific incidents in those countries, analysing the Foreign Office response to them at the same time. So I say this, I hope not proudly, but honestly, that the review constitutes a substantial body of evidence. It weighs in at 176 pages, and it has no fewer than 718 footnotes. And the website, christianpersecutionreview.org.uk, contains yet more evidence deliberately archived there for future research purposes. So what then did we find? At one point in the independent review, I say that there are two existential threats to human flourishing and harmonious communities in the world today. One is climate change, and the other one is the systematic denial of freedom of religion or belief in different places and in many ways globally. Now, that was not a conviction I had when the review's work began, but it grew on me as the work progressed. Indeed, I was shocked by the scale, the scope, and severity of the phenomenon. Now, I hope we have begun to realize the importance of addressing the first of those two, climate change. But it is high time now that we recognize the importance globally of addressing the second. But how do I justify that general assertion? Well, let me take you to George Orwell's book, 1984. I think we should all read that book regularly every few years because it contains stark warnings for us. And the most chilling aspect, I think, of George Orwell's book is the existence of the thought police and the concept of thought crime. Why the most chilling? Because to be denied the liberty to believe what you want to believe, and I include in that the right not to believe, to be denied the liberty to believe what you want to believe is the most fundamental denial of human rights. And that's why I say that I believe that freedom of religion or belief is not simply one right amongst many, but is the one on which so many others depend. Because if you are not free to think or believe, how can you order your life in any other way that you choose? And that is certainly what Eleanor Roosevelt, the prime framer of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, believed. And of course, we also honor Charles Malik for the incredible work that he did in framing that declaration, and in particular, framing the vitally important Article 18 of that declaration. And yet, what we found is that in so many places around the world, this fundamental right to believe what you want to believe is questioned, compromised, and threatened. So we do need to ask why the violation of freedom of religion or belief is so widespread and affecting Christians on pretty much every continent, This is, as I said before, a global phenomenon with multiple drivers, even though, as I say, there are many in the West, too many, who would like to attribute it to one cause alone, by which I mean Islam. But the truth is this: if you lift the stone of persecution, as it were, and look underneath, what is it that you find? In contexts where governments are weak, and I'm thinking particularly of Central and South America, you can find gang warfare on an industrial scale that is driven by drug crime. In other contexts, you find authoritarian, totalitarian regimes that are intolerant both of dissent and of minorities. Elsewhere, you can find aggressive, militant nationalism that insists on uniformity. You find religious zealotry and fundamentalism in many different forms that often manifests itself in violence. And you often find those phenomena combined as well. In other words, in our world today, we find massive threats to human flourishing and harmonious communities. And ultimately, we find in those things significant threats to our own security as well. So if we care about those grave issues, we should certainly care about the persecution of Christians and about freedom of religion or belief more generally. We can no longer say that this is a special sidebar issue for a special interest group, just of interest to people of faith. These are huge issues that we face in the world today. Sadly, the COVID-19 crisis has only exacerbated the situation. Weak governments have to give all their attention, or have had to give all their attention to managing the pandemic. Authoritarian regimes have used the situation to accrue more power to themselves. Militant nationalists have blamed minorities for the ills that are visited upon them, and religious fundamentalism has used the crisis of the pandemic as a cloak for increased persecution. There are many sinister forces at work in our world today, with many suffering as a consequence. And the situation, sadly, is getting worse and not better. It's got worse since I wrote my report. India and China, to take two examples, they were hardly on the radar a decade ago. But look at the genocidal fate that has faced the Uyghurs in China. Pew Research now considers India the worst place in the world for societal violence against minorities. Russia has become increasingly intolerant of faith minorities. So the time for inaction and indifference is over. And therefore, as the report argues, if the Foreign Office, if Western governments more generally took this issue with the seriousness it deserves, then those governments would simply do their job better by helping them to address some very serious phenomena in the world today. So, how is the UK Foreign Office doing? Well, I can only say what I found 3 years ago. I cannot say how things are now, and I know that the UK government is committed to implementing my recommendations. What we found 3 years ago was a mixed picture. There was certainly good practice in some places and in some areas, but in others, not so good, although I am absolutely certain that it is handled excellently here in the embassy, here in Beirut. And actually, we have just come from the Adjan Foundation, and it was just a delight to witness their work. And I know that the British Embassy here have been great supporters of that work. And that is exactly the kind of engagement that I think the UK government needs to have in actors like that who are making a very significant difference on the ground. And I also want to say I'm immensely grateful to the many people at the Foreign Office who allowed this unknown bishop and his team to peer into so many aspects of their work. One challenge we did find is that in many ways, and I'm sure the UK isn't unique in this, many diplomats don't tend to stay all that long in post. So there is a real challenge in how do you get to know the country as well as you might do. We also found that too much, perhaps, depended on the commitment of individual diplomats rather than on the implementation of policy. The Foreign Office has something excellent called the Forb Toolkit, which posts are supposed to use, but we did find that some didn't. And we did find that too much really depended on the particular interest of particular diplomats. But as I say, that was 3 years ago, and I'm sure the situation has changed. One thing we did argue, and again, we wanted to put this very clearly to the Foreign Office. We argued that the abuse of FORB intersects with other key issues which the Foreign Office does indeed take very seriously. Violating a person's religious freedom frequently means a violation of other key human rights, rights such as freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, freedom from torture, the very right to life itself. And yet that is the lot of religious minorities the world over. If the right to FORB falls, so many other rights fall as well. Thus, many religious minorities, many Christians amongst them, live in much greater poverty and suffer from greater food insecurity than do members of the majority community. Many religious minorities, of course, are ethnically distinct as well and are marginalized as a result. So there are, frankly, simple issues of racism at work in all of this as well. There is, we discovered, a particular intersection between the denial of FORB and gender equality. Globally, for example, Christian women are far more likely to be victims of discrimination and persecution, including people trafficking, gender-based violence, kidnapping, forced conversion and forced marriage, than are men or members of the majority community. Thus, they suffer a double discrimination. They are marginalized and abused simply because they are both women and Christians. So my point is this: we cannot see this as a sidebar or a special interest issue. It bears upon some deeply serious issues in today's world, issues with which Western governments are rightly concerned. Issues such as trade, poverty, security, racism, women's rights, and the very right to life itself. And that's why I argued that FORB should be central to the FCO operation and culture, and that a commitment to it should be enshrined in strategic and operational guidelines. So if the Foreign Office cares about those issues, and it certainly does, I assure you, then it should certainly be concerned about Christian persecution and about abuses of FORB more generally. And if the Foreign Office and other Western governments take FORB more seriously, then I do believe that they will become more effective at addressing all of those other human rights issues as well. So, what did we recommend? As I've said, this is a serious issue and it needs serious responses. And that's why the recommendations of the review were as bold and far-reaching as I believe them to be, arguing that FORB should be front and centre in the Foreign Office's policy and operations. There are two main thrusts to those recommendations. Actually, there are 22 of them. Shall I go through? No, I won't go through all 22. First of all, central to them is an argument that the FCO should promote FORB indiscriminately and for all, and not just for Christians. Remember that I was commissioned to look at how the Foreign Office had responded to the issue of Christian persecution, but I was very clear from the word go that my recommendations would be framed in terms of guaranteeing freedom of religion or belief for everyone. And I argued that for two main reasons. First, if you single out any one community, as I said earlier, that just makes that community more vulnerable, and we have to avoid that. That's why the recommendations of my review warned against what you might call unintentional othering of the Christian community. If we exercise favoritism towards Christians, we risk portraying them as agents of the West and thus increase their vulnerability. And of course, Christians in India, Christians in Egypt, Christians in Lebanon do not want to be portrayed as some kind of Western import, but as authentically Indian and Egyptian and Lebanese. Indeed, there have been Christian communities in India, in Egypt, in Lebanon long before there were any Christian communities in the UK. So my clear conviction is that the single way to protect Christians from persecution is not to single them out for special treatment, but to guarantee freedom of religion or belief for everyone. And secondly, it is simply not part of the Christian tradition to seek special favors for ourselves. We must love our neighbors indiscriminately, without picking and choosing or exercising any favoritism or making a special case for those who are like us. So the first main thrust was that the FCO should promote FORB indiscriminately and for everyone. And the second was that the FCO should address this issue more proactively and face it head on. Indeed, as I say, I recommended that this should be central to the FCO's culture, policies, and international operations, because this is not a peripheral issue that can be relegated to the sidelines in today's world. It touches on some key and critical issues that we face globally. So, I made my 22 recommendations, and then something remarkable happened. Not just the Foreign Office, but the government as a whole accepted the recommendations of the report in full. They confirmed that commitment after the 2019 election, and they've done so subsequently since. Frequently in Parliament, they have confirmed that. And that was certainly more than I hoped for or expected. Indeed, I was saying on the way here tonight, I expected that we would produce this review and then it would gather dust on a government shelf somewhere. But it hasn't. And I would certainly say that these issues are on the political radar in the UK and more broadly in the world today in a way that they simply were not before. And for that, I am deeply grateful. There's another subsequent development that is worthy of note. In the wake of the publication of the review, we established something called the UK Forb Forum, a round table that gathers together around 90 different stakeholder groups from a whole wide range of backgrounds: humanists, Jewish, Islamic, Hindu, and others too. We liaise very closely with the all-party parliamentary group on FORB, as well as the Prime Minister's Special Envoy, and the forum is deliberately action-focused, enabling very diverse stakeholders to make common cause on issues of mutual concern. An early example of this that delighted me was Humanists UK, an avowedly humanist atheist organisation, and CSW, an avowedly Christian organisation which is committed to FORB for all. They campaigned together in support of Mubarak Bala, the president of the Humanist Association of Nigeria, arrested and now imprisoned because of his activities in that role. That would never have happened before we set this forum up, and I look forward to that, to the UK Forb Forum continuing to catalyse significant activity to defend and promote FORB worldwide in the future. And that is one of a growing number of round tables around the world that are being proactive in addressing this issue. Subsequently, too, the International Religious Freedom of Belief Alliance has been set up. This last summer, the UK hosted the major international FORB ministerial conference, in which I know a number of people from Lebanon were present. So my review is just part of a growing international movement that I believe is of great significance for the world today. And in that international movement, Lebanon has a critical role to play. I know that this country faces many challenges, but your studied commitment to religious plurality and diversity is unique in this region, and it must be upheld, and it must be safeguarded. You now have your own FORB round table established here. Next year, you will host the meeting of the International Religious Freedom of Belief Alliance, and it is no coincidence that it is going to be held here. As I said earlier, the Beirut Declaration is a groundbreaking piece of work to be celebrated and to be proud of, and I honour all of you who are engaged in this movement to promote freedom of religion or belief as a force for good in our world here in Lebanon. I know it isn't always easy to do it, and that is why, in particular, I honour you for not giving up in that struggle. Now, it is not for me to tell you in Lebanon what to do, but I do want to say that I do think you have a critical role to play regionally and globally, not just nationally. You have a critical role to play, I believe, in moving from what you might call an accidental plurality in this country to intentional diversity in a world that is increasingly marked by division. In such a divided world, Lebanon could, I believe, have a truly prophetic role to play in championing FORB at every level of society and increasing genuine diversity, inter-community diversity within this nation. The fact is that we simply cannot afford to be religiously illiterate in today's world. To be religiously illiterate in today's world is simply to fail to understand how and why others act as they do. That's why I argued that the FCO simply needed to increase its religious literacy just so that it can do its job better. This isn't an option. If you fail to understand the influence of Confucianism as well as Marxism on the Chinese Communist Party, you will fail to understand the Chinese Communist Party. And of course, if you fail to understand the role of the Russian Orthodox Church in Russian society and Russian politics, you will fail to understand Russia. It's certainly worth asking, as we look back on the disaster of Afghanistan, whether the key role of religion was critically overlooked there too. And I note with sadness the failure of all Western governments to recognize and respond to the extreme vulnerability of religious minorities in that country. So this is a time for action, I believe. I believe that now, more than ever, we must defend the right to freedom of religion or belief, and not just defend it, but promote it. Promote it. It is needed now more than ever. We must stand against those who would betray it and undermine it through violence, through crime, through militant nationalism, through authoritarianism, through religious fundamentalism and bigotry. It matters hugely, I believe, to our world today that we should do that. And it matters hugely that we should defend those many whose welfare, liberty, communities, families, and very lives are being put at risk by those dark forces. So I hope and I pray that my recommendations will continue to make a very significant difference in the days to come as part, as I say, of a growing global movement. I was proud to present those recommendations to the Foreign Secretary, deeply honoured that he commissioned me to do so, and delighted to see what impact they are making. It is vital, as global citizens, that we open our eyes to this issue and recognise it as the serious issue that it undoubtedly is. One of my heroes is the great anti-slavery campaigner William Wilberforce. And in one of his very first speeches to the British House of Commons on the slave trade, as he presented Thomas Clarkson's monumental report on this wicked, terrible phenomenon, Wilberforce said this: "You may choose to look the other way, but you can never again say that you did not know." Well, now we know that this is a huge problem in our world too. May we too not look the other way. May God give us strength instead to face up to this great challenge of our times, just as Wilberforce and others did in their day too. Thank you very much.
Bishop Philip, thank you. Thank you very much for sharing with us what you have shared with your government. Thank you for the job and congratulations for the success, for the job done in a very short time. And now, as I said before, we have maybe 10 minutes for questions and answers, if you like. And Bishop Philip will answer from here. Yeah. Maybe we need a micro. Just one moment.
I ought to say that if Naila Tabara is going to ask me a question, she almost certainly could answer the question better than I could.
Maybe you can ask the question in English or in French?
Yeah. But I will be asking it in English. Okay. Thank you very much, Bishop Stephen, for all of this. We loved every minute of your speech. I have a question, though, because there was one group of people who suffer from Forb violation that you didn't mention, which is people belonging to the majority religion, but who have a different interpretation. And those are sometimes being jailed or even suffer from capital punishment because of that. So, if you have any words on that.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really important. I mean, in the Western tradition, at least, we have sometimes tended to call those people heretics, and we have done terrible things historically to heretics. And yes, it is still a phenomenon. You know, the right to dissent is such an important right, and again, we have to stand up for that. You know, faith traditions ought to be able, in their own right, to convince people of their value. And coercion has no place in faith, I believe. No place at all. So thank you very much for highlighting that, Niall. It's very important.
Bonsoir. Merci
Bonsoir.
pour votre...
Vous êtes où?
Ouais.
Bon.
Merci pour votre intervention, très riche. Vous avez évoqué très rapidement l'impact de la crise environnementale sur les minorités. Est-ce que vous pouvez nous citer un ou deux points plus élaborés que vous avez identifiés qui impacteraient les répressions envers les minorités?
Pardon.
Ça marche pas?
Non, ça marche.
Ça marche.
Mais j'ai pas tout à fait compris.
Vous avez évoqué l'impact de la crise environnementale
Oui, merci.
sur les répressions des minorités à travers le monde. Donc, est-ce que vous êtes très vite passé au deuxième point. Est-ce que vous avez peut-être une ou deux idées à nous donner?
Oui,
oui, je représente à Rocha.
Très bien. OK. So I will answer in English. I want to say two things about that. I do think there is a relationship between the issue of climate change and the issue of the denial of freedom of religion or belief, or the vulnerabilities that are created. So first of all, climate change creates significant vulnerability amongst the world's poorest people, just as the denial of freedom of religion or belief does. I was at the Lambeth Conference, which is the global gathering of international Anglican bishops around the world, and we were listening to people from. I was on the table with people from Madagascar, who were talking about, you know, climate change for them is not a future threat. It is a present reality that creates significant food insecurity. For example. So we have, in both of these phenomena, the phenomenon of climate change and the phenomenon of Forb violations, it is the world's poorest who tend to suffer. The terrible injustice of climate change is that it is produced by the world's industrial economies, and it is those who are yet to industrialize or yet to benefit from all of that who suffer most from it. But I do think there's another connection between the issue of climate change and Forb. I think that they're not just sort of, as it were, coincidentally the two big issues of our time. I want to say this, that I think it's only states with a heart for what you might call the common good, a good beyond themselves, that are going to care about climate change and going to care about freedom of religion or belief. Put it bluntly, the other way around, I doubt very much whether Kim Jong-un or the Taliban are that concerned about climate change, and they certainly don't care about freedom of religion or belief. But I think acting on Forb and acting on climate change have common roots, and that springs from a common concern for the common good. If you don't care about the common good, you will not champion Forb, and you will not be concerned about climate change. I don't think it's any coincidence that the world's two greatest polluters, China and India, actually that's not entirely fair, is it? Because the US is a terrible polluter as well. Okay, two significant global polluters, China and India, are also places that have been very bad news from a Forb perspective. And I'm not suggesting that there's a direct causal relationship between the two, but I do think there's a moral connection between the two. If you care about the common good, if you care about this planet, if you care about the welfare of communities in this planet, then you will care about both those issues.
Thank you very much for a very profound lecture and report. I appreciate very much what you have said about your role in Syria, in Lebanon, Egypt, and in the MENA region. And you don't want to show that you are protecting the Christians, because that backfire on us.
Yeah.
I am someone who believes very much that, you know, unless if our Muslim brothers and sisters, in this context we are in, if they don't believe in having us along with them in this arena of religious freedom, there will be no way they accept any other intervention on that. So that's really very great. But at the same time, I want to say, anything that is being done now in the West, which is against Muslims or whatever, it backfires on us as Christians here.
Absolutely.
Have you at all looked into that? That's one thing. And the second, you spoke briefly about atheists. Where do atheists stand in your status of religious freedom?
Yeah.
Because these days, we are witnessing a big revival of atheism in the Arab world. We have thousands and thousands, and they are afraid and scared to show that. Where is that in your map?
Thank you. So I'll take those 2 points in reverse order, but they're really important. We tend, in the West at least, we tend to use the language of freedom of religion or belief. Not freedom of religion and belief, but freedom of religion or belief. Deliberately, so that it includes the right not to believe. I come back to what I was saying to Naila. Coercion should have no place in religious faith, and people should be free not to believe that if that's what they want to do. And I'm very clear that we have to stand for that. That's why, as I say, I'm delighted that Humanists UK, Andrew Copson, the chief executive, is a good friend of mine. We're very unlikely friends, but we are good friends. And I absolutely stand for Andrew's right not to believe. Of course, I want him to believe what I believe. He wants me not to believe like he does. But that doesn't stop us being friends, and I absolutely stand for his right not to believe. I also take your point absolutely about a negative impact on Muslim communities in one part of the world can have a detrimental impact on Christian communities and other faith minority communities in another part of the world. That's why I was very, very keen from the word go, and just to repeat what I said, there would be many people on the far right in the UK who would have loved to have used my report as a stick to beat Muslims with. And I was never, ever going to give them that opportunity. It was never going to provide ammunition to the Islamophobic far right, simply because I stand absolutely against Islamophobia, but also because of that practical reason that you cite, that to victimize Muslims in one place has the net result of victimizing other communities in another place. Again, I say it from the heart. We have to stand for freedom of religion or belief for everyone, without fear and without favor. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, we've been recently in Germany for the World Council of Churches
Indeed.
Assembly, and we had several talks with bishops and priests and people in charge of positions in some churches in Europe. What I saw, what we could locate while observing what's going on there, churches being closed, some are sold, some are giving for rent out, people removing their name from the register of Christians, the attitude of the secular who are secular-atheist people, and the whole process. I felt, as a sociologist, I see long-term trends. I felt as if Christianity in Europe, this is why I locate in Central Europe, is moving toward shrinking area and becoming in a situation of awkward situation or persecuted situation. I really foresee, if I see the average of people going to the church, the average of age of people going to the church, churchgoers, the number of people going there, the whole attitude toward Christianity, it put me in sort of fear and sort of anxiety as to the Western Christianity. Am I correct? Can you comment on that?
No, I can comment on it, and you are correct. I would say that the weight, the center of global Christianity has shifted. It's shifted in the last, I don't know, certainly 100, maybe 50 years, and it's shifted from Europe into Africa, and indeed parts of Asia as well. And that's where the real strength of the Christian church is today. Not in Europe, not even in North America, but in Africa. We say as Anglicans in the Anglican Communion that the typical Anglican today is female, under 30, and in sub-Saharan Africa, and probably living on about $1 a day. I am not a typical Anglican. And yes, there are great challenges facing the church in the West. I'm very conscious of it in our diocese, that we have an aging population. I just want to pick up one thing that you said, and I do not believe. I believe that from time to time Christians may face some minor inconveniences and be misunderstood in the West, and there is some silliness around in some quarters. But I'm very, very resistant and reluctant to equate that with the kind of serious persecution that many Christians today in the world today face. And I'm quite impatient with people in the UK who try to claim that they're being persecuted, because they're really not.
Question in Arabic, and then one more question.
الله يعطيك العافية. شكرا على اللقاء الطيب. بداية صاحب السيادة أبدأ بآية قرآنية عندنا في القرآن الكريم. الحق سبحانه وتعالى يقول: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم. تحدثتم سيادتكم عن طبعا التاريخ شهد العديد من محطات مليئة بالإرهاب والاضطهاد، ولكن هذا العنف الذي شاهدناه جميعا نحن نقول لم يقتصر لا على فئة ولا على دين ولا على مذهب. لأجل ذلك نحن نقول أن الإرهاب أو الاضطهاد ليس له دين. الأديان جميعها أكبر من هذه الممارسات، وسيادتكم تعرف ذلك. من هذا المبدأ أفضت حضرتكم الكريمة طبعا عن الاضطهاد المسيحي، ونحن لا ننكر أن هنالك اضطهاد مسيحي، ولكن السؤال الموجه لسيادتكم: ما رأيكم فيما شهدناه من سنوات مثلا عن وثيقة الأخوة الإنسانية التي وقعت ما بين قداسة البابا وشيخ الأزهر؟ هل عالجت شيء من هذه الهواجس التي طرحتموها مثلا؟ ثم تحدثت أيضا حضرتكم أن الاضطهاد أو ضد المسيحيين تحديدا يتزايد، وأن الغرب كان رده ضعيف. يعني ما هو برأيكم ممكن أن يكون الرد يعني غير ما نشهده الآن أو غير هذه الحوارات واللقاءات التي نتحدث عنها؟ وشكرا.
Thank you. I just want to repeat what I said, that I do recognize that Muslims are more likely to be the victim of persecution than they are the perpetrators. I absolutely agree with what you say, that persecution has no place in any religious practice at all. And just to repeat as well what I said, I was asked by the Foreign Secretary to look at the issue of the persecution of Christians. But I can tell you from the very beginning, indeed, I can tell you where I was. I was standing in a car park in Truro, in Cornwall, and I said to myself, the only way I can do this piece of work with any integrity is to argue for freedom of religion or belief for everyone. For everyone. I must argue for that for my Muslim friends, for Jewish friends, for Hindu friends, for Rohingya, for Yazidi, for whoever they may be. We have to say this is a human right that belongs to everybody because we're human. It doesn't belong to me specially because I'm a Christian. It doesn't belong to any of us specially. It belongs to us all because we're Christians. Sorry, because we're humans.
We have the last one, very, very short question.
Yes.
Thank you.
Your Eminence, let me share with you one of my fears that become bigger tonight.
Yes.
Do you think that the concept of religious freedom going to be the new tools for the superpower countries to interfere inside the third country agenda?
I hope not. I mean, I think if I can take a specific example of the moment, what you see in Ukraine is a government that is intolerant of religious freedom. So the state of religious freedom in areas of Ukraine that Russia has taken over are significantly worse than in the rest of Ukraine. Significantly worse. Russia, it's very bad news to be a Jehovah's Witness in Russia. Russia is increasingly religiously totalitarian, I would say. I think that the Russian Orthodox's church's support, unequivocal support for President Putin is absolutely shameful. Absolutely shameful. I can see nothing of the Christian faith in his endorsement of the appalling action that the Russian government have taken in Ukraine. So I don't think. Just repeat the premise of your question.
Going to be the new tools for just for making a new colonization?
No, I think actually standing for freedom of religion or belief is the very antithesis of colonialism. It's saying this world needs to be a free and open space for people to believe and order their lives in the way that they want, without outside interference, without coercion, but in genuine freedom.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Bishop Philippe. Thanks for you all for coming, for following us on the media. And now we are all invited for vin d'honneur. Merci, Père Recteur.